So I'm sitting here with distinguished Professor Mark P. Andersen, all the way from Australia, who is a clinical psychologist for many years and also a guest professor here at Halmstad University. And we are looking forward to and discussing what's to come in the Nordic Sport Science Conference that will be here in Halmstad University. I will do a presentation there, looking in much inspired by your work about Buddhism, psychology, neuroscience, and the topic of my presentation starts with: is there room for the Buddha in sports psychology service? So I take this opportunity and prepare myself by asking you, who I got the inspiration from, is there room for Buddha in sports psychology service?
Yeah, it's a good question, because it's an interesting question, because Buddhism and mindful practices and those sorts of phenomena have been around in sport for a long time. You can go back into the 1970s, maybe it was earlier than that. Very famous little book called Zen and the Art of Archery. And then I think in the 70s also, Joe Hyam's Zen in the Martial Arts. A very famous book in golf called Golf in the Kingdom, which wasn't really so much about Buddhism, but there was a very Buddhist mindfulness flavor to it. That's a classic in golf. And you could probably type Zen and sport in some, Amazon book search, and you'll find Zen tennis, Zen, swimming, Zen gymnastics, Zen something. So there's a long tradition of Buddhist kind of principles, practices, and sport. But it's really quite interesting to note that if you type in sport psychology practice or something like that and do Buddhism, what you'll find will probably be all the most recent stuff on mindfulness in sport and exercise psychology. And that's where it's really emerged since the early 2000s, I guess, 2004, 2003, especially with Frank Gardner and Zella Moore's the mindfulness, acceptance, commitment approach to sport performance. And so you have Mac, and then we see, like, even at the conference we were just at in Bratislava, there was a few presentations on ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy, and those have as a basic component a mindfulness part of the treatment, of the therapy. And so those are all Buddhist related, but in a rather narrow application of mindfulness. So I think there's plenty of room, and when you think of mindfulness and think of sort of basic Buddhist principles of being in the present moment, being right here, right now, being unattached to outcome and more involved in process, that's been around in sports psychology forever. And when you think of something as basic as a relaxation exercise, pay attention to the tension in your hand. Now let it go, and notice what it feels like as your muscles relax. So what are you doing? You're doing essentially a basic mindfulness exercise with your body. You're paying attention to right here, right now, what is happening in your muscles. Sports psychologists have been doing mindful practices, which are, come from Buddhism and from even before Buddhism, mindful practices the whole time. It's just they didn't call them that.
So maybe I should reframe my topic then from something, is there room for the Buddha in sports psychology service, to something more like, where do you find Buddha right now in sports psychology?
That's a good one. Finding the Buddha in sports psychology services, and and then this, but to get it sort of beyond mindfulness and looking at compassion and self-compassion and finding the Buddha in those sorts of ways, and finding the Buddha in sort of conceptions of self and how we try to either build self up or in Buddhist traditions realize that there is no core self there. There's all sorts of ways in which you can bring the Buddha into, but I think he's already there in several different ways already. And when you meet a sports psychologist who is quite present and compassionate and quite a little baby Buddha, the Buddha's there in their interactions with you. You feel comfortable. I find that's a very, the Buddha's around, or at least he's in the neighborhood.
Nice. So if you want to touch more upon this, mindfulness is getting more and more, and you saw at the NISP conference here in Bratislava weeks ago that it's very accepted, especially among young sports psychologists. But if you want to introduce more of the Buddhist philosophy to a new coach or athlete, or where these concepts of Buddhist philosophy may be a bit scary, do you have any tips for me? How do I introduce the Buddha to coach?
Yeah, well, maybe you don't use the Buddha's name. maybe you use somebody else's name. It's like for one of the sources I often talked with my students about that they could use for coaches and athletes to bring the sort of mindfulness, compassion, interpersonal mindfulness, interpersonal compassion for others, creating environments that are loving and caring rather than environments that are full of threat and anxiety. I often tell my students they really should go out and get Phil Jackson's book, Sacred Hoops, because Phil Jackson he practices mindfulness. He takes some elements of even Native American sort of philosophical worldview types of things, but it's a very mindful coach. He was a coach for the Chicago Bulls. He coached Michael Jordan. I think anybody listening to this will know who that is. NBA championships, and so very, very famous. You can see a lot of Phil Jackson's mindfulness stuff and coaching on YouTube.
Yeah.
He's all over YouTube. So I think that's one way to introduce folks to it, because here you have in front of you a very famous coach, a very successful coach, talking about mindfulness and compassion.
Sounds like a good guy to help to introduce the Buddha.
Yeah. Yes, he's a good guy. Yeah, he's a good introduction to the Buddha. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, and I think I just wanted to highlight the importance of that I think comes from all the stuff in the Buddhist philosophy, and as you also mentioned before, there's lots of things going on in neuroscience, which are related to Buddhism.
Well, we know. There are lots of information now in neuroscience, especially in looking at treatment of people, say, with anxiety or depression, even some with eating disorders, and looking at changes in the brain with using mindful practice, and that we see changes in the brain, say for an anxious person after even 8 to 12 weeks of mindfulness training. We see that the anxious area of the brain, the parts of their brain that were more active, the more anxious parts of their brain that were much more active before they started begin to quiet down, and the parts of their brain that are more involved in sort of approach, interest, curiosity, those start to become more active, while the anxious parts become less active. And there's a lot of evidence in neuroscience for the effectiveness of mindfulness on things like anxiety and depression and other mental conditions. So there's a lot of support for the Buddha in Western hard science.
Cool. So thank you very much for helping me out introducing the Buddha. Yeah, I will
Finding the Buddha.
finding the Buddha and introducing him and everything with it. Yeah.
Okay,
Definitely.
great.
Thank you.
You're welcome.